Hi, I'm Erik Voss, and this is a breakdown of The Walking Dead Season 8, Episode 4, Some Guy. And yes, the bullets were flying this episode, sometimes in ways that didn't totally make sense or seem believable. But if you could get past that, I actually thought this was a really solid episode that finally broke down Ezekiel's falseness and said goodbye to a beloved CGI tiger that I'm sure AMC was very happy to not have to pay for anymore. I'm going to break down all the deeper connections that you might have missed, some interesting choices made in the cinematography, and possible cultural influences. But before we get to that stuff, let us start with the big question, brought to us by @MIDancer7. What was with those barrels, and has Ezekiel changed? How so? Okay, well that's two big questions, but I actually think they're connected. So the barrels we're referring to are those toxic waste barrels that were leaking into the ditch where Shiva died. So let's dive into the secret of this ooze. So it was kind of hard to tell while you were watching this sequence, but this toxic waste was causing chemical burns and skin abrasions on the walkers that were following Ezekiel, Carol, and Jerry. Their skin became bleached and severely pockmarked. So on a literal level, this is just some good, gruesome, grotesque horror for Ezekiel, kind of like those gross melted walkers from season 5, but I think it also has some metaphorical significance. As I'll discuss later, this episode is all about melting away Ezekiel's false outer layer, as the violence and the horror of this failed mission shock him into his true vulnerable self. Now, these gooey walkers are the same kingdom soldiers Ezekiel led into battle, and their disfigurement from this toxic waste reflects the morphing of Ezekiel's outer appearance, as he ends this episode looking as if he's seen a ghost, or, a few dozen of them. Now, obviously, Shiva's death in this scene was a huge deal, and a lot of you were asking why she had to die, both narratively and, I assume, a general existential why. But I'll get to that and more thoughts on Ezekiel when I discuss the deeper meaning later. First, I want to talk about how this episode compared with the version of these events in Robert Kirkman's source material. So let's initiate our segment. In the comics, okay, yeah, that's great. So Ezekiel's defeat and Shiva's death go down in issue number 118 of the Walking Dead comics. And while the defeat is certainly a tragic eye-opener for Ezekiel, I was amazed at how emotional and earth-shattering this could feel. A big part of that, of course, comes from actor Khary Payton's performance, his heartbroken wail at the top of the episode, and his silent walk of shame back into the kingdom just made for such a dramatic and traumatic gut punch. Also in the comics, this whole defeat is told to us secondhand by Ezekiel as he narrates his shock and his shame, but I like this adaptation to place the events mostly in the present as we see Ezekiel's facade collapse in real time. You can almost pinpoint the second his heart rips in half. Now, some of you may have caught another possible wink at the comics, but it is a huge spoiler that happens way later, so if you haven't read the comics and you don't want to know, skip to this time. Okay, the savior named Gunther, the Jeffrey Dahmer type guy, threatens Ezekiel by telling him your head on a pike will do just fine. Okay, while Gunther obviously doesn't deliver on that threat, this could be a subtle foreshadowing of Ezekiel's future death much later in the comic timeline. Probably the most shocking twist in the comics, at least after Negan kills Glenn, comes during the War with the Whisperers, when several key characters get killed in a surprise attack that leaves them with their heads on pikes, including, tragically, our king. Now, if the show ever goes in this direction, we're still a long ways off, but the back of my mind is really, really dreading seeing this on screen. Okay, let's move on to these subtle, interesting ways this episode connected to past episodes in our section, Callbacks. Okay, this episode was directed by Dan Liu, a longtime editor of the show, and I believe this is actually his first major time directing, but you can see how this guy totally understands the show's visual language because he made some awesome visual choices. First was this awesome jump cut from Ezekiel's pre-battle speech at the kingdom, an overhead shot of the kingdomers fawning over him, to those same kingdomers dead, that same affection for Ezekiel causing their doom as they shielded him from gunfire. Now, obviously, this contrast has some thematic significance that I'll get to later, but I also love how this is a visual callback to the iconic closing shot of the very first episode of the series. Remember that overhead shot of Rick in the tank covered by walkers. The parallel of this shot to the shot of Ezekiel in the kingdom foreshadows how Ezekiel's own people will shortly turn into monsters trying to devour him. Okay, I don't know if you guys caught this, but part of the reason this contrast jump cut works so well is the music. Liu directed Ezekiel's speech to be so hopeful and forward-looking, and he reused the same victory music that played in the mid-season finale last year that was titled Rise Up. This music, of course, abruptly cuts off when we cut to the bloody aftermath of this battle. Also, Carol fakes surrenders to the Saviors, posing as a weaker enemy than she really is, just to lower their guard before suddenly attacking them. Remember, this is the same move Carol pulled on the Saviors in season 6 when she pretended to surrender but really had a trick up her sleeve. It was a gun. She had a gun up her sleeve. Yeah. I actually really liked how this episode compared Carol and Ezekiel as role players. This is a parallel the show has brought up before, and both of these characters have hidden behind false personae of charmers. Ezekiel was a zookeeper and a part-time community theater actor who now plays the part of a larger-than-life king to inspire his community and make them feel safe. Carol is a tortured killer who has previously masqueraded as a meek Suzu homemaker type, so her enemies will see her as less of a threat, which, yeah, they totally shouldn't see her as less of a threat. In this episode, Carol refers to the decision she made to become someone different, saying how she decided, but life decided some things too. I think this is calling back Carol's gradual transition over the series, a change that was both caused by her own actions, like burning Tyrese's girlfriend in the prison and killing Lizzie in season 4, but really something life also decided for her, going back even further to losing Sophia in season 2 and her husband Ed abusing her. All right, let's move on to some possible cultural influences and references on this episode in our segment, Under the Influence. Now, I really like the opening sequence of this episode with Ezekiel getting ready for this battle. This is all shot like Ezekiel is a stage actor putting on pieces of his wardrobe in front of a green room mirror, which is exactly what this is for Ezekiel. It's a show. This also reminded me a lot of the opening sequence of the Game of Thrones season 6 finale, which opened with very similar shots of each character meticulously getting into their costumes, gradually leading up to the sudden violence that would happen that day. This scene even features some soft piano music that evokes Game of Thrones' Light of the Seven from that episode. And in both cases, the music scores these characters as if they're preparing for a funeral that day. The shots of the Kingdom's soldiers saying goodbye to their families, combined with the bloody aftermath, was certainly hard to watch, both for Ezekiel and for the audience, but I couldn't help seeing a connection between these shots of carnage and Saving Private Ryan. In that film, Steven Spielberg took a commonly romanticized historical event, the D-Day invasion during World War II, and instead showed us the horrific violence of the real sacrifice of those soldiers. Severed limbs, spilled entrails. This is what a .50 caliber machine gun really does to the human body. The Saviors were using the same kind of mounted machine gun that the Germans fired on the Allies landing on the beaches at Normandy that day. And as we pointed out, some of the gunfire in this episode was a little unrealistic, with Rick and Daryl's car chase being a good example. Yeah, it's a little weird that machine guns could tear apart human bodies, but more or less just kind of bounce off of Rick's Jeep. But in my eyes, this chase isn't really part of the episode tonally. It's kind of in a different world. It's pulling actually from another famous Spielberg movie, Raiders of the Lost Ark. Now, unlike Saving Private Ryan, Raiders was actually aiming to be a romanticized view of a World War II era adventure. So the mission isn't like a debate between holding a line and protecting human lives. It's more of a pursuit of an ever-important game-changing weapon which passes back and forth between sides, kind of like a football. In this case, the Ark of the Covenant is the Browning machine gun. When they load it up actually in the case, notice how it's shot in a close-up, similar to the way that the Ark is loaded up at the end of Raiders. And yes, this action does go down in a very heightened, romanticized Raiders style, with Rick heroically leaping onto a moving vehicle and fighting the driver. Indiana Jones does this exact same thing. So while this episode is all Spielberg, which is exciting, it's kind of mixing eras of Spielberg, which is creating a bit of this tonal confusion. Now, speaking of Spielberg, this may just be me, but this shot of Shiva's blood clouding the ditch water reminded me a lot of that shot in Spielberg's The Lost World Jurassic Park when Dieter gets surrounded and eaten by the compies and his blood seeps down the stream. There's also a shot of Ezekiel's bloody hand bursting out of the corpses of soldiers. Now, this could be an homage to Brian De Palma's iconic jump scare in Carrie with a bloody hand bursting out of the grave. Now, okay, moving on from the influences, let's look more closely at some of Dan Liu's visual choices in this episode in our segment, Zoom and Enhance. Now, I noticed this in past episodes, but I like how we get a good look at Ezekiel selecting the red feather for his hair. On a practical level, this links him with his soldiers. The kingdom distinguishes itself with red armbands, red being the color of its insignia that we saw last season. Now, I actually wouldn't be surprised if the color-coded armbands was Ezekiel's idea. This is kind of a theatrical, practical way that it's very much in his wheelhouse. But on a metaphorical level, the color red also marks all these characters for death. Red is commonly used that way in literature and cinema. Actually, Spielberg famously used it with the little girl in Schindler's List. But on a character level, this red feather is also kind of a symbol of Ezekiel's naivete. It's the same accessory worn by Peter Pan in his cap, you know. So in a lot of ways, Ezekiel begins this episode as a Peter Pan type, a childish warrior in a Neverland utopia who believes that he's invincible and he'll never die, which I guess Carol then would be the Wendy whom he's trying to convince to stay with him in Neverland. I haven't really thought this metaphor through, but I guess in this version, all the lost boys die. When Ezekiel crawls away from their corpses, he notices a tiny flower on one of their armbands that was given to this woman by her son earlier, and it's interesting how now this flower is recontextualized as a flower for her grave. And earlier in the episode, we get these close-ups of Ezekiel preparing his dreadlocks. Now, Ezekiel's hair is a reflection of the power he's trying to exude. It's almost like a lion's mane. But later, notice how the zombified version of Daniel grabs Ezekiel's hair to pull him in. The king's costume has become a literal vulnerability, just like how playing pretend has made reality an even tougher pill for him to swallow. And let's look closely at the framing of the shots that open and close the episode. Early on, Ezekiel is framed in close-up, filling the frame, unable to be contained as his people clear the way for him. The final shot shows him in a distant wide shot, a long take of him limping back into the kingdom as his people stare at him in disbelief and judgment. Ezekiel's changing size in the frame tells the story of this episode. He begins as a larger-than-life, powerful figure, totally in control, but he ends as a tiny, wounded animal limping home with his tail between his legs. And that brings me to the deeper meaning of this episode. It's titled Some Guy, a phrase that Ezekiel says verbatim as he confesses to Jerry, "I'm not your king, I'm just some guy." Earlier, Ezekiel is called out as a con man in a costume. Revealing that this emperor has no clothes is the whole point of this episode. He's a part-time theater actor who, when discussing war, quotes Shakespeare. And while his warped worldview is useful in inspiring and reassuring his people, when the shit hits the fan, he doesn't at all understand the reality of his violent world. And the death of Shiva is essential for Ezekiel's awakening. Shiva embodied Ezekiel's hyperbolic, unrealistic stature. Even if you didn't buy Ezekiel's heightened brogue and booming voice, the tiger was the big stick and the tangible source of Ezekiel's power. Without Shiva, Ezekiel's character act doesn't really hold up. So now he must confront who he is as a man and how, ultimately, he's just some guy. Okay, let's check in on the kill count of this episode. This episode might have seen the highest number of on-screen casualties in an episode yet. It's easy to forget that when the world of this show is filled with walking corpses. But I don't think we've seen so many people start off the episode alive and then end it dead. Like, the bodies really hit the floor this time. Topping the list as the deadliest would be Carol, by my count. She killed 7 humans, 2 of whom she killed by opening those gates and releasing walkers on them, and at least 14 walkers, bringing her total to 21. But let's be honest here. The real winner of this episode was this inanimate 50 caliber machine gun. This son of a bitch wiped out nearly all of the kingdom's army, nearing, by my count, 34 people. Now, I guess we could credit the team of saviors operating it for those kills, but I don't know, guys. I think in this case, I'm okay with saying guns kill people. And now let's quickly look ahead and make some predictions for next week's episode, episode 5, titled The Big Scary You. Now, promo footage makes it seem like this will be a Negan-Gabriel-focused episode, with the two bottled up at the sanctuary after the season premiere. There's also some shots of the savior captains, Simon, Dwight, and Eugene, and the others snapping at each other in search of the mole. Now, if this does end up being a bottle episode, I'm excited to see where this could go. Like, the Simon-Dwight storyline could end up being sort of a Reservoir Dogs type story, with the guys testing each other's loyalty in the aftermath of a shitstorm. Meanwhile, based off footage and shots from the trailer, I'm wondering if Negan's scenes with Gabriel could end up playing out kind of like a Catholic confession, in which case this could be the episode. We finally learn Negan's origin. Now, I won't say exactly what his backstory is in the comics, but I have a suspicion/theory that the letter U in the Big Scary You title could refer to the U shape formed by the lines of a basketball court. Huh? Comic readers know where I'm going with this. Do you think Ezekiel deserves the trust of the kingdom? Is there enough of a leader under that kingly persona to carry the remainder of the kingdom through this? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments down below, or you can tweet directly at me, at Erik Voss, or follow New Rockstars on Twitter, at New Rockstars, for updates on our videos. Now, this video is brought to you by our good friends at Loot Crate. Loot Crate is a monthly subscription box service for epic geek and gamer items and pop culture gear. For less than $20 a month, you will get 6 to 8 items that include licensed gear, apparel, collectibles, unique one-of-a-kind items, and more. It's great. There's always stuff in there that I would never think to buy for myself. Loot Crate has supported YouTubers since the company shipped its first crates, so by supporting Loot Crate, you support our channel. Sign up at lootcrate.com/rockstars and enter the code ROCKSTARS to save 10% on any new subscription, or click the link in the description below. So I'm gonna unpack last month's crate. It had the theme of mythical to give you an idea of what to expect. The November Loot Crate theme is Unite, and it contains cool items from Star Wars, Batman, Guardians of the Galaxy, Overwatch, and more. You have until the 19th at 9 p.m. Pacific to subscribe and receive that month's crate, and when the cutoff happens, that's it, it's over. So start collecting this great gear. Like this video and subscribe to New Rockstars for deep, obsessive analysis of The Walking Dead and all the stuff that you love. And if you want to help us shift this channel away from YouTube ad restrictions, you can help contribute any small amount to us on Patreon. Big thanks to all of our donors, especially Lori Denning. All right, thanks for watching. Bye.